World History Discussions Chapter 3, Part 4. And yes, Part 3 ended abruptly because somebody rudely gave me a junk call, and that disrupted the video, so I put my phone in airplane mode so that nobody can interrupt me with calls or texts when I'm doing these world history videos. So we were talking about the Hyksos invasion of Egypt in 1674 BCE. They came from somewhere in the Middle East, and they brought bronze weaponry and horse-drawn chariots, much like the Hittites had brought iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots when they had invaded Babylon and sacked it in 1595 BCE, almost a century after the Hyksos invaded Egypt. But this is a big turning point in Egyptian history. As I was saying at the end of the last video, you probably learned in school that a big advantage of ancient Egypt was their isolation, which is largely true. They got the Sahara Desert on either side, and they got the Mediterranean Sea. But now, after the Hyksos invasion, that ends about 2,000 years of isolation in Egypt. Now Egypt had to get an army, and they had to get bronze metallurgy, which was expensive because copper and tin were expensive. But eventually, they got an army, and by 1550, they had pushed the Hyksos out of Egypt and reasserted themselves in the New Kingdom. So again, this is thousands of years of Egyptian history, but when we talk about the pyramids, that's around 2500 BCE, and that's the Old Kingdom of Egypt. But by far the wealthiest kingdom and the most imperialistic was the New Kingdom of Egypt. Just to give you a clue of how big the timeline is, I'm going in a major digression, but pyramids built around 2500 BCE. King Tut, this is around 1300s BCE. We're going to get to that later. That's in the New Kingdom. And Cleopatra, there's a country song called Cleopatra, Queen of Denial by Pam Tillis. Cleopatra, now we're talking about era of Julius Caesar and the early Roman Empire around 30s BCE. So basically, each of those big events associated with Egypt is more than 1,000 years apart. And to think that the era of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and all that is actually farther removed from the era of the pyramids than it is from today. 2,000 years before today, the era of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and all of that, and that was 2,500 years after the pyramids. So we're talking about a long period of history. But anyway, the New Kingdom of Egypt is Imperial Egypt. Not only do they conquer a lot of the Middle East and bump right up against the Hittite Empire, we're talking about 1400 BCE, but they also drop way down into Kush, and they conquer a good bit of Nubia as well. So now I'm going to go back to maps and show you Imperial Egypt. Their main ruler was Thutmose, who did most of this conquering, and he was in power from 1479 to 1425 BCE, and this map was around 1400 BCE. You got the Hittites in purple, and you got the Egyptians right here in yellowish orange, and this forced the Kushites to move from Kerma to Napata. They don't move to Meroe till the 500s BCE, but you had Thutmose in power, and then later you had Hatshepsut reign alongside of Thutmose, and she was Egypt's only female pharaoh. She only ruled for 15 years when Thutmose was still basically her stepson, and I believe a teenager at that time. Anyway, about a century later, you have Akhenaten and King Tut. I'm going to save that for when we talk about Egyptian religion, because that's an interesting discussion in and of itself. But right now, I'm just trying to give you the timeline. So the Egyptian New Kingdom, much like the Old Kingdom, is about a 500-year period. Old Kingdom being 2660 to 2160. New Kingdom being 1550 to 1070 BCE. But then after 1070 BCE, Egypt goes into decline. This is where you get into some interesting stuff with Kush. But I'm going to go back to this timeline. So here's Egypt, Egyptian Old Kingdom, and then the Intermediate Period, and then the Middle Kingdom, then the Hyksos invasion, and now the Egyptian New Kingdom. And you can see who their contemporaries were. The Hittites, they didn't mess with the Mycenaean Greeks, but it's the same era. And Babylon was in an intermediate period. And now we're going to look, if we can, at Kush, which is over here, Kerma. So this is early sub-Saharan African civilizations. Kerma, we're in the second millennium BCE there. And Kushite Empire, 700s BCE. And this is where I'm going right here. So after the Egyptian New Kingdom declined, and you're in the third intermediate period, this really lasts, I know they say till 700 BC, but it really lasts until 332 BC when Alexander the Great conquers Egypt. Egypt is pretty much frozen in time for the next about 700 years. The culture doesn't change much, but it's no longer a real high society. British people will get mad at me for saying this, but I think you can compare it to the fact that the United Kingdom was the top country in the world in the 19th century in the reign of Queen Victoria. Even the United States, which was a young country, was more in its shadow, even though it declared independence. But the UK dominated the world all the way up through World War II. Now the United States dominates, although I think it's kind of losing its prominence today as well. But if you go to the United Kingdom, it isn't that different, I would argue, probably from 19th century UK. I mean, it's different because time has changed a lot, but it's developed. It's first world. It's not a third world country. It's not a client kingdom. It's independent. And basically, Egypt was very much the same way for those 700 years. It kept its Egyptian culture, just like Britain keeps its British culture in the 21st century, but it isn't dominating the world like it was in the 19th century. So same thing with Egypt. Egypt wasn't dominating the world anymore. In fact, they were getting a lot of different foreign rulers, one of which was the Kushites themselves. So in 760 BCE, Pianki from Kush invaded Egypt, because Egypt, like I say, was in an intermediate period. And for a while you had the Kushite, I believe that was the 25th dynasty of pharaohs, or the Black Pharaohs, coming from Kush. And at the same time, what's going on to the east is the Assyrian Empire in northern Iraq. We talked about them in the last chapter. And in 671 BCE, the Assyrians invade Egypt, and they push the Kushites back. About 20 years now, where Egypt has kind of got the Assyrians in the north and the Kushites in the south. But by 651 BCE, the Assyrians push the Kushites out too. Then, 612 BCE, the Assyrians collapse under their own weight. So Egypt is free now, and a resurgent Egypt in 591 BC goes and invades Kush. And you see this recurring theme for many, many times in the 2,000 years from about mid-2000s BCE to 500s BCE of Kush invades Egypt, Egypt invades Kush, and this is a recurring theme. But 591 BCE is a major turning point in the kingdom of Kush, because Egypt sacks Napata and forces the Kushites to relocate to Meroe, which is around the Fifth Cataract and about 1,000 miles south of Aswan. And after this, Kush starts to develop more or less its own culture, more independent of Egypt. In fact, the last time that there were really any expeditions from this part of the world down into Kush was around the 100s CE. No, it was actually around 50 CE under none other than Nero and the Roman Empire. Was the last time that people from the Mediterranean ventured into Kush and traded with them. And then, as I mentioned, you have Greek geographer Ptolemy in the 150s CE who describes the Nile source as the mountains of the moon, which we now know as the Rwenzori Mountains around Uganda. But basically, sub-Saharan Africa loses a lot of contact after 591 BCE with Egypt and the whole Mediterranean world, and they kind of develop their own culture until about the 300s CE when Kush is absorbed into Axum, modern-day Ethiopia. In fact, it even shows that on my timeline map over here, because I showed you Egypt, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom. And then you hit this intermediate period and it just kind of dead ends there. Like I say, Egypt doesn't really change culturally until 332 BC when Alexander the Great conquers them. And then they very much become Hellenized or Greekified. But you can see that Egypt goes into Kush, and you got the dynasty of the Black Pharaohs. I was right, 25th dynasty, said that from memory. So you got Kerma up here, that was early Kush, coexisting with the Egyptian Old and Middle Kingdom. And then you've got Kush itself, which is at its height right there in the 700s BCE. 760 BC, they conquer Egypt, which is in its intermediate period, but then the Assyrians in 671 BC conquer Egypt. And then Egypt conquers Kush, which is not on this map, but after 591 BCE, Kush is kind of on its own course. And then you can see Aksumite Empire, and that's around 300 CE that Kush basically gets absorbed into Aksum. That's much later. We're going to talk a lot about Aksum in later chapters. Spoiler alert, around 325 CE, King Ezana of Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia, converts to Christianity. It's one of the earliest Christian kingdoms in the world. But that's basically your history of Egypt and Kush, and this chapter gets as far as 332 BCE when Alexander the Great conquers them. We'll talk about him a lot in chapter 10 of this when we talk about the ancient Greeks. But there you have it. That map is of Egypt, Imperial Egypt at its height around 1400 BCE. So before we get into the actual cultures of this region, the main thing to remember is just that this is a lot of distance, a lot of geography. As I said, this is about 600 miles to Aswan from Alexandria, and then it's another 1,000 miles to Khartoum or Meroe, just north of Khartoum. Nile River itself is about 4,000 miles, 3,000 to 4,000 miles, or longer than the United States is wide. And so we're talking about a big bunch of distances, but we're also talking, and then as I mentioned, we're going to get into this with the Bantus. Africa is 3 or 4 times the size of the United States, and the Sahara Desert, North Africa, about the size of the United States, a little bit bigger. So again, big land areas. And timeline too, we're talking 3,000 years of history, just like we were talking about in Mesopotamia in the last chapter discussion. So long periods of time. So quick sweep up summary, 3100 BCE, Archaic Kingdom starts under King Memes, and then you have the Old Kingdom from 2660 to 2160 BCE, with their peak being around 2500 BC with the building of the pyramids. That was in the Old Kingdom when the pharaohs were considered divine. We're going to get into all that in the very next discussion. Then you have the Dry Period, which ends the Old Kingdom. You have the First Intermediate Period, and then the Middle Kingdom from about 2050 to 1676 BC when the Hyksos invade Egypt, and then Egypt is no longer isolated. It has to build a bigger military, and they expel the Hyksos in about 1550 BCE, and the New Kingdom comes to power, which especially under the Pharaoh Thutmose III from 1479 to 1425 BCE, they're an imperial power conquering much of the Levant, all the way up to the borders of the Hittite Empire, which we talked about in chapter 2, and they're also conquering down into Nubia. And they're very powerful. I would argue Egypt at its peak from the 1400s to about 1070 BCE until they go into decline. And the New Kingdom Egypt kind of goes into decline about 100 years after the Hittites collapse and the Mycenaeans in Greece collapse, and you're in this Bronze Age collapse, which I said kind of put the Middle East in this intermediate period where Lebanon, Phoenicia is really powerful, and Israel is real powerful. David and Solomon around 1000 BCE. So we're talking that era. Egypt just kind of is frozen in time for the next 700 years, but the big event, like I say, is around 760 BC when Kush conquers Egypt, and then almost 100 years later, 671 BC, Assyria conquers Egypt, and by 651 BC, Assyria's kicked the Kushites back south, and then 591 BC, Egypt itself after the Assyrians have collapsed in 612, Egypt itself goes and conquers the Kushite kingdom and forces them down to Meroe. And then Kush kind of takes its own course. Egypt gets invaded by Alexander the Great, and they're the Ptolemaic Empire. We're going to get to that in chapter 10. That's after 332 BCE. But Kush, on the other hand, just goes on its own culture and develops a culture very different from that of Egypt until about 300s CE, when Aksum, Ethiopia, incorporates Kush. So there's your couple thousand years, 3,000 years worth of history of the Nile Valley. And so the next discussion, we'll talk about culture.